We are now all sitting in our comfortable homes, but we are not built to be comfortable. Like a ship's not built for a harbour. It's built to go out there. And this evening, I'm going to share a song that was released only about 3 or 4 weeks ago by the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. It's "We are not made for the harbour, we are built for the sea." And have a look, watch the video as clear as the internet connection allows us to. And as we watch, reflect on where we might be being sent that might require us being brave. So enjoy this as our opening worship piece.
We are not made for the harbor, we are made for the sea. Though at times it's wild and cold and dark, it's where we're meant to be. And launch us out as a fighter, though we may be tossed about. But your presence in the storm, it walls us in, calls us out. You left a safe port of heaven for the elements of earth. This God at risk exposed. You lift our eyes to horizons where that heaven brushes earth, and this worn world is transformed. We are not made for the harbor, we are made for the sea. Though at times it's wild and cold and dark, it's where we're meant to be. And launch us out as a fighter, though we may be tossed about. But your presence in the storm, it walls us in, calls us out. You sent us out to the market, sent us out to the fields. Jesus, hope ambassadors. We take no purse for the journey, but take your authority to declare that all is yours. We are not made for the harbor, we are made for the sea. Though at times it's wild and cold and dark, it's where we're meant to be. You launch us out as a fighter, though we may be tossed about. But your presence in the storm, it walls us in and calls us out. Out to the office, leaving his mark. Out to the factory, his spirit the spark. Out to the school gates and out to the bars. May we risk what was never ours. We are not made for the harbor, we are made for the sea. Though at times it's wild and cold and dark, it's where we're meant to be. You launch us out as a fighter, though we may be tossed about. But your presence in the storm, it walls us in and calls us out. We are not made for the harbor, we are made for the sea. Though at times it's wild and cold and dark, it's where we're meant to be. You launch us out as a fighter, though we may be tossed about. But your presence in the storm, it walls us in and calls us out.
And let's begin with a word of prayer. Let's pray together. Loving God, may tonight be an encouragement to each of us, to the three of us who are hosting and presenting, but may all of us be blessed as we learn from one another, as we look boldly at what might be, and go bravely wherever the winds of the Spirit may be leading us. Hear as we pray, and draw comfortingly close as we brace ourselves to go boldly and bravely. Amen. Tonight, it is my hope that you will help me finish preparing for tonight's session. Isabel had thought we had already all prepared. Well, actually, the way that I'm looking for tonight to go, particularly for the first half of my session, was that it's to be interactive and conversational as much as is possible in a Zoom room. To help me do this and to make sure that we are able to do what you hope tonight is going to do, I'm going to ask that we go into a breakout room right at the very start of this evening to complete some questions and conversation starters. Isabel's put them in the chat box for you. They are also up on the screen. In my context, church is. In my context, community is. So complete those two sentences. And then have a think in your group. There are only going to be 3 or 4 of you to each of the groups. Now, in what ways, if any, has the pandemic helped you shift those definitions? So perhaps in January 2020, you would have said church was one particular thing. Maybe that's allowed you to change that. And the last question is one of the perennial problems that I'm hoping to learn a wee bit more later on with Heather is, how do you measure success in your congregation? And I want you to be as specific as you possibly can be when it comes to that. So those are your 3 questions. We are roughly spot on time. You're going to get 9 minutes or so in each of your groups.
Right, so people are all coming back in. Then Douglas is going to ask for a little bit of feedback from those questions.
Excellent. As I'm speaking, feel free to read the chat. That is the purpose of tonight. It's to hear from one another. It's to share with one another. I'm going to share just now how we blended those 2 questions together here at Eastnewt Trinity and St. Monans. We held a series of community events. What's happening here? Why has it not done that? There we go. We held a series of community events where we wanted to hear what people thought. Now, I know you'll not be able to read the screen share. This here was printed off in massive big paper. This here was printed in A0 size and put on the walls of all of our church buildings so that there was no excuse of not knowing what we are doing missionally. The 2/3 to the left of the page are our journey through from lockdown right through to where we are at now in the bottom right. Now, we are all in the midst of presbytery mission planning excitement across the whole of the country, and that's where we're at too. But what is really important to focus in on for us was look at where we've been without the next steps. There's where our church is. A lot of people are putting in the chat, and I'm seeing up here, it's a people of faith, not buildings. In my context, church is a community of faith, living faith out. But others are saying to many people, church is the buildings that we've become attached to. Interestingly, on that sheet that you see on the screen, rarely was buildings mentioned other than buildings closed because of lockdown. Buildings reopened because we can reopen. One of the folks in my group talked about church being a gathering of people where people can come together. Church can be in a whole variety of different ways. It's God's people praising with common faith. Now, here's one here that church is tired, elderly, and needs to modernize. That there, we might see that as a fairly miserable sentiment, but how positive is that, that we have recognized it? That there's a real excitement for me, because we need to look at how we can engage. So that sheet you see was for the congregations, but we also invited in the community to have a say on what we are doing and the journey that we've been on and where we're going. So I'm now going to move back to question 2 being community is. So if you can pop into the chat box just now, what is community? And we'll have a look at some of these responses as people are typing. So just now in this moment, scroll back, see what's happening. Community is us, and community is common interests and purpose, which is almost a very similar definition to somebody had placed there about what church is. Church is where people gather together to share faith, to learn from one another, to worship God, and be prepared to go and tell others of that. So community here is the people I interact with. And that could be the workplace, online, Facebook groups, neighborhoods, and the people round about you. We exist in so many different places, and how we exist, how we interact with other people is the hallmark of us being part of a church community. Keep the answers coming if you've not typed them in or whatever, that's absolutely grand. What we're going to do just now is to have a think about the third question. Did the pandemic change your view? In one of the groups just there, they were talking about how the pandemic actually thrust people forward to embrace technology. Now, I'm going back to the comment that somebody else said, church was tired and elderly. One of the most refreshing things was to see people going, well, if I want to go to church, I'm going to have to learn how to use that iPad that has been sitting in the corner of the living room. And lots of people have embraced it. And we have reached so many more people because they don't need to have that physical step across a boundary. Separated from buildings, people felt that they could walk in that wee bit better. The pandemic helped people to see that worshipping God could be done anywhere, and it's how we behaved and interacted. And I think one of the other things that was there was the pastoral consideration. It really highlighted to people how we maybe didn't support people pastorally well enough, and allowed us to really reflect on that. That was one of the groups that had said that. But others said it allowed us to re-establish connections with people. Now, those connections were re-established because perhaps we were providing access to something that they maybe felt that they couldn't approach because of a length of time, perhaps. After this series of consultation events, one of the key things for us that somebody said here, technology also isolated people. We'll come back to that in a wee second, and it's absolutely true. The pandemic, in terms of how it changed communities now, a lot of them have been drawn into themselves. So how do we do that? How are we able to do that? Now, what we're going to do just now is I'm going to take you forward to talk through one of the things that we were able to do. Somebody said here, pandemic showed us how telephone calls could be used to make meaningful connections. What you see up here is a series of things that we were able to try and do. Now, I'm not saying that these were hugely effective and that they were the answer to absolutely everything. We launched something called Hope Cafe. Hope Cafe was effectively a home cafe church style for different age demographics. We then launched something called Tea Time Together, which is a family service but held online at tea time. What we had discovered was all children need to eat. Now, that's not a massive revelation to people across the country, I am sure. But if schools were to go back and meet normally, sports clubs, music clubs, and all of those things, that happened. So what we were then able to do was they still needed to eat. And that's one of the things that we had at tea time. They were able to have a limited period of screen time. Imagine Blue Peter meets Songs of Praise. That's kind of what we did. On the top left photo that you see there that's just one of the nights that we met, and they were decorating biscuits to talk about pigs. Different people, all ages, all stages joined in. We did Really Wild Welly Church. We weren't allowed to meet in buildings, but at one point the rules changed and we could meet outside. So church met outside in different places, in forests, on beaches, in lovely weather and in horrific weather. But in each of those pictures, each of the months that we ran that, people turned out and worshipped God in nature. I'm going to ask a question at this point, and I'd like you to use the chat box as I move on to my next slide, which is to look at, yes, we're here to think about how we engage with families, but here's how we engaged with older people within families. So as I'm going through this slide, if you can put in your chat box how your church measures success now, that would help me when I get to stop screen share in just a wee bit. Up here, we have got smaller groups. Small groups that met, that led to Cafe Church being formed and held more regularly. What we've also got here is we couldn't meet inside, so we met outside. And our Hope Cafe brand existed in different places. One of the things that we tried through Lent this year was to have a series on broken and covered some really hard-hitting themes, and we did that together, but we did it in small groups that formed much larger community. In the top left picture, that's a small group that was hosted here in the Manse. Those people then went away and hosted other groups in their communities. They came together and then went and hosted smaller groups that replicated that modeled example. They met, they discussed, they shared with one another. It was a hybrid model, so there was some online, acknowledging that some people still don't like or feel apprehensive about meeting in larger groups. So for us, one of the things that really struck us was the pandemic allowed us to really evaluate what church was. It allowed us to see where our community had needs and how we might address them. But more than that, it allowed us to think about how we measure success. And I'm really heartened to see a lot of comments here, which is about personal engagement. It's about how people interact with one another. It's about the people returning and coming to things, engaging and connecting with other people. And someone else has just said here is most of our church measures success in the contacts we make with people who aren't connected with the church pre-pandemic. That's a fantastic statement. I really like that. That's very positive to look at. For us, one of the things that we wanted to do was to build exactly on that measure of success. Quality of engagement. How is success measured? I want to share with you this. We wanted to give all of our wider community of the whole of the East Neuk some hope after what had been 2 long lockdowns. The Field of Hope was launched, and quite literally the word hope was in a field of sunflowers. In that, we were able to engage with so many different people and so many different community groups. The purpose and what I want to take away from all of this is how do you measure success? I would be suggesting it's about the quality of engagement that you have intergenerationally and how that transcends different age groups. Where we found greatest success is where people of the older generation meet with folks of the younger generation. I know lots of chronological older people who are still children at heart, to the point of on Sunday, I was talking to 2 children and I said, would you 2 like to come forward and try and light these stones on fire? So I just pointed and said, would you 2 like to come out? There were 2 more mature people who all stood up and they were about to come out and try and light stones on fire. We need to find ways of church being part of the community. Being bold and being brave. Far too often we are considering church as being successful if that translates to full pews on a Sunday morning or full seats if you are fortunate enough to have a flexible sanctuary. Is that a good qualitative measure of success? It's a quantitative one, which is important. I understand that. But what we are looking at here is very much about perhaps smaller church groups forming a larger community. where the community is as we defined further on up in our chat. When we were talking about what community was, community here is the cohesion where common interests and purpose are shared. We can find that that transcends the age groups. We don't need to be within all of that, stuck within something. So smaller church groups becoming part of a larger community is exactly what we would like to aspire to have and to do. And somebody's just written that exact thing there as well. So what we wanted to do was to bring different, if we are able to be the cohesion, we learn and we teach in church, but we all belong to different community. Now that community could be smaller, part of church, but form that larger community sense. And when church is held in smaller groups and in smaller ways, then larger community might be built out of that. Now, I appreciate the screens are probably small, particularly if you're a mobile device. I'm happy to share with you the graphics that have been used. Consent's been got from those who are in the photos. And I can email that to you, or if you want to call, text, WhatsApp, whatever, my number's up there as well. The impact of what we do sometimes cannot be measured. The impact of what we are doing, it might feel that we're plugging away at something and not really, we get disheartened with smaller numbers. But the quality engagement, there was a photo that was up there and it was me working alongside somebody in a garden. It was in the garden that we were trying to develop as part of our Really Wild Welly Church, and we're going to celebrate that harvest at the back end of the year. We were chatting about why we were needing to thread a net through a cane and then batter the cane. Now there was a degree of trust. I held the cane and gave a 4-year-old a mallet. But there was trust. There was something that we shared, a moment that was shared. That Sunday, that young girl was in church and we were talking about how we needed to support one another. And from the second front row, that's like that net we put for the peas to climb up. They needed support so that they didn't die. And the church is just like that. And the community is just like that. And when church and community go hand in hand and meet each other's needs, that's how we are going to be able to build Christ's kingdom, I believe. And it's about slowly but surely chipping away and not being afraid of doing small. A lot of people will say, oh, you only have, let's say, 6 families joining you on a Wednesday evening at tea time. That's 6 more than we had if we didn't try and do something. That's formed its own community. Those who attend the Really Wild Welly Church and gather from the community to come and share this common purpose, where we can share our faith as we do that, that's another way of us slowly but surely building that bigger community. How do you measure the impact that you're having? You don't. It's about quality of engagement and the quality of conversations that you have. I've said that, but I'm now going to hand over just now to Heather. And Heather, I'm hoping, is going to be the answer to what I have been wondering. How do we measure stuff within the church, and how do we do that effectively? So I'm going to hand over to Heather just now, who's going to share with what she's been doing.
Well, now gets to be the fun part, because now I get to say, yes, I was doing qualitative research rather than quantitative. So a bit of background. I'm Heather. I now get to call myself Dr. Heather Major, which is great. So I did 27 months of fieldwork, qualitative fieldwork in the borders, with a couple of churches that were both part of separate linkages, looking at the question of sustainability and whether or not there was a future, or a sustainable future, for mission and ministry in small rural churches. And it was interesting. It was interesting after sort of 27 months of living with churches to have a reflection on what the present situation is and what the possibilities for the future might be. Essentially, my general findings were that the current model of mission and ministry is unsustainable. That probably isn't a surprise to anybody in this room, because the current model of mission and ministry, particularly in rural parish churches, relies on dwindling resources, both human and financial, is overly dependent upon ordained clergy, be that stipendiary or retired, is often burdened by deteriorating and or inaccessible buildings. So many of the old churches are very difficult to access, particularly for people who have challenges with mobility. Churches in rural areas, particularly small and aging congregations, are increasingly insular, isolated and inward looking, and they often lack a sense of purpose or vision. However, what I found as I was going through researching these questions and looking at the bigger conversations that are happening in rural ministry around the UK and worldwide is the possibility for creative and sustainable change, for transforming what we do when we're thinking about what it looks like to be in rural churches. And that's where I came up with the title. So the title that I gave to Isabel prior to coming into this was Rural Relationships, an Incarnational Approach to Contextual Mission and Ministry. Because the key that I found from living with these churches was that it was about relationship, building relationships, and recognizing that becoming incarnational was key to a sustainable future in mission and ministry, which bridges brilliantly from where Douglas was going. Because a massive part of what it means to be incarnational is to be engaged in everyday activities, in everyday communities, recognizing the fact that every single person who is in church on a Sunday morning has the capability and the opportunity to engage missionally with the people that are part of their individual communities. Particularly when you're talking about a small area, be it in a rural place or be it in a small community within a larger village or within a city, people see what you live like day to day. It's not just about the hour that you spend on a Sunday morning. It's also about how you walk your dog, whether or not you say hello to somebody when they're not at a church event. So when we're talking about things like being incarnational, then we mean 24/7, 365, or 366 sometimes, recognizing that every single day, every single interaction is an opportunity. So when you think about your community, who are your neighbors? Who are the people that you interact with? One of the common threads, shall we say, that I see when we look at rural churches particularly is this whole idea of an aging congregation. There's an aging congregation, the demographic is changing within churches, and automatically people say, well, if we just fund a youth worker, that will sort out all of our problems. No, it will not, because it's not enough to bring somebody in to build relationships with children and young families. Every single person in the church needs to think about how they speak to children and young families. There are opportunities for building intergenerational relationships with families week to week. In the daily week, or the daily weekday? No, let me try that again. In ordinary weekdays and work days. How do you speak to children that you meet in the shop? Children that you see running around in the streets, or maybe they're playing a ball game. Is there an opportunity to be able to start building those kinds of relationships? Because if there's one thing that I learned, both in being a pastor's kid and then all the way through living in churches and being involved in doing the research that I was doing as well, people resent being missioned. They resent being brought in for a program to fill numbers and then not having anybody speak to them through the week. So if you have people who come for an event or come for say a summer program, come for a Sunday morning, make sure you say hello to them when you see them through the week, because that is where you get the most impact. The most impact comes from seeing how your community can be transformed by those day-to-day engagements. It's about relationships, not about programs. Multi-generational relationships, team relationships, recognizing that it's not just about clergy, particularly not when we are at a time when the Church of Scotland, amongst other churches, but the Church of Scotland is reducing the number of active full-time ministers, particularly in rural areas. When I was carrying out the research that I was doing in the borders, I had various people who came up to me and said, so you're studying theology and you're studying churches. Does that mean you're going to be an ordained minister? And I said, no, I'm not. But as a Christian, I have a calling to be engaging in mission and ministry every single day, because that is part of what it means to be a Christian. So I built relationships. I had conversations. And one of the most iconic moments, one of the most iconic conversations that I had during my research was actually with somebody who was curious about what I was doing and was curious about whether or not church was important. And I said, well, yes, because my faith impacts everything that happens in my life. It impacts the way that I think, the way that I speak, the way that I interact with people. It's totally transformed who I am as a person. And he sat there and he went, if somebody had told me that when I was growing up in church, I might not be a Buddhist today. And I thought, okay. And he said he had been looking his entire life for something that would impact the way that he lived day to day. But when he had been growing up in church, all he heard and all that he thought church was about going, sitting in a service, standing, sitting, praying, singing, and then walking out again at the end of the service. And that was it. That was all that church was about. That was all that Christianity was about. And I think there are a lot of young people that might think the same thing. When they're thinking about church, maybe they think about, oh, there's this messy church event that happens every 2 months. There's this, oh, we have an all-age service, which, let's be honest, most all-age services are actually designed for families, and they're pitched for young children, which makes them inaccessible for people who are single or for people who are older, who are really, really struggling with this. So there's quite often a balance to be struck in how do we actually work together as a full community? How do we work together with rural relationships? One of the key elements of being incarnational is about saying, how do we facilitate those kinds of relationships? How do you facilitate all age services where you hear voices from different generations? Maybe you have somebody who's in their 90s who comes up to try and light a stone on fire. Maybe you have somebody who gets up to do a reading and they help somebody who's maybe 6 or 7 who's sounding out the words, and you get somebody who's in their 60s who stands with them and helps them work out individual words so that you can have a Bible reading that sounds like it's living, sounds like it's something that people are engaging with because they're getting to read it. A huge part of this is about identifying gifts in individual people. Every single person has a particular set of gifts. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough. We don't recognize the fact that I might have different gifts from Douglas, but we both have an opportunity to be able to speak. We both have different relationships that are important, different conversations that we can be part of. One of the things that I really liked about the ReNew, the idea of ReNew, is this being church and ministry with children and young people. Being church, not doing church, being church. How do we live? How do we engage? When we're talking about mission with families, I think the key point is with families. Have you tried getting children on your leadership team? Try going into a school. If you really want to put yourself on the spot, go into a school and go, ask me questions. Don't go into a school with a pre-prepared talk. Go into school and say, what do you want to know? You'd be amazed what children come out with. And one of the things that is extraordinarily helpful for a lot of people in smaller churches or in smaller rural areas, believe it or not, you are going to recognize these children. You will get an opportunity to watch them grow up. If you have an opportunity, speak to the school, because a lot of schools, particularly RE teachers or RMPS teachers, whichever classification we're going for, they're always looking for contributions from people of faith, because it means that they get a break. And sometimes that can be extraordinarily helpful because you have an opportunity to go in and just respond to questions. Respond to questions, build relationships with individual people, with individual kids, and then be prepared, because they will ask you awkward questions as you're walking down the street. So take time to listen. I think that's the thing I'd like to finish off with, is relationships are about communication, and communication is just as much about listening, if not more about listening, than it is about talking. I remember somebody telling me at one point, not that I've listened particularly well to this one, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you speak. I'm not always great at that, but I think that's where I'm going to kind of finish off at this point. And then we can bridge to the next thing.
Thank you so much, Heather. That's added an awful lot more to think about. We're going to go into breakout groups. I've just put a couple of questions in the chat to guide your discussions, but you could take it any way you want and pick up things that Douglas has shared and things that Heather's shared, but particularly think about what new, bold opportunities there might be in quite small ways, possibly, as you look forward, and how you might move your congregation towards trying some of these things. After the breakout groups, there's going to be a time of plenary where we can bring questions to Douglas, to Heather, to each other, and discuss any of these areas a little bit more. So just be aware of that, and you can put those questions into the chat and we'll pick those up afterwards. Okay, so I think you'll be in the same rooms as you were last time. So have a good conversation. I'm just going to change the time because you think you can have 10 minutes to have a bit of conversation, to dig into those things. But I hope people are feeling encouraged as we've heard those opportunities from Heather and Douglas.